We know that the brain has an incredible ability to change and adapt. But what does that mean for our youngest learners? When a baby isn't meeting developmental milestones or a toddler is struggling with speech, behavior, or social connection, parents often wonder whether to wait or act. The science is clear. The earlier we act, the greater the opportunity to harness neuroplasticity and change developmental pathways. Hello, I'm Dr. Karen Wilson. I am the host of Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. I want to be clear that today we are talking about rewiring young brains, but we are not talking about fixing a child or changing the essence of who a child is. We're talking about how interventions help kids reach their full potential by changing the way their brains are organized. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Vianna Nelkin, a licensed pediatric neuropsychologist, mom, and founder of the Children's Neuropsychology Center. Dr. Nelkin specializes in supporting infants through young adults with personalized, evidence-based care. Together, we'll explore how neuroplasticity works in the developing brain, why early assessments matter, and how intervention can reshape a child's future.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Dr. Nelkin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor and such a pleasure to get to chat with you.
I am so glad to have you here to talk about a topic that is really key to the work that we do. Mm-hmm. We do assessments, and I always tell parents that that's not the end. That's actually the beginning, right? We're getting this roadmap, but it's what we do after with the information that is so crucial. And it ties in directly to our topic of neuroplasticity, which is why we want this information, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I wonder if you found this in your work that we do in pediatrics, that I find the concept of neuroplasticity to be just so empowering, and that installation of hope that our brains can grow, they can rewire. It really reframes what we do. And I think it's something that I say a lot with parents, or encourage them to think about, that this isn't a life sentence. Nothing that I tell you is going to say that your child is broken. What I'm going to tell you is how we can harness their strengths to really support those stretches and reframe the narrative.
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. I love that the use of the word stretches, because oftentimes, historically the language has been so pathologizing, but to talk about, what we can do with this information and how it relates to your child's potential is, like you said, it's so empowering.
Exactly. I like to tell families that I don't focus on the label, I focus on potential.
Yes. And maybe we can start by telling our listeners what neuroplasticity is. I mean, you've kind of alluded to it, but I think that is so important to kind of maybe start with, what are we talking about? Because I think as neuropsychologists, it's like, okay, we know what neuroplasticity is, but other people may not know exactly what we mean when we use that term.
Yeah, I think of neuroplasticity as the brain's superpower. It's really this incredible ability for our brain to learn and grow and adapt. And it can grow and adapt and learn in the face of challenges, in the face of, happy things or positive experiences. And it's our brain's ability to rewire itself and grow and learn, essentially, at its core.
Yes. And like you said, that is so powerful, because it means that where you are now is not necessarily where you are going to be. And it speaks again to what we talked about at the beginning, that potential, because we know from decades of research that the first 3 years of brain development, really shows that the changes that can be made are astonishing, right? The brain is changing at an astonishing rate, and it continues to change for a long period of time.
Yes, exactly. I think, in our field, you said exactly, right? We think of neuroplasticity, and there is truth to be said, right? Neuroplasticity is at its peak in those early developmental years and slowly starts to taper off. However, the literature has also supported that we can grow new neural connections and grow even well into our, senior years. And so having this ability to, reflect on, again, a label or a diagnosis, it doesn't mean that my child will never acquire a new skill. It just means that we need to work those muscles to build some different neural connections or reroute some neural pathways.
Right. And again, if we could tie it back to the whole idea of doing assessments, we get an idea of a child's learning profile, those strengths that you talked about, and then those areas where a child needs more support. And the neuroplasticity idea speaks directly to that because neural pathways, that are used frequently get strengthened, right? And while those that are not getting used frequently get pruned. And so we have the ability to strengthen those pathways that are weaker or relatively weaker than others.
Exactly. I like to think of interventions as just like an extra day at the gym. You're working those muscles that just may, need a little bit more work and fine tuning, and, seeking intervention and seeking support or obtaining accommodations even at school doesn't mean that you're less than, or again, something is wrong with you. It just means that your brain processes information differently, and we're giving you the support and tool to strengthen some of those connections in your brain.
Right. And maybe you can tell, our listeners about why, again, thinking about brain development and the power of neuroplasticity, why it's so important for early intervention, early identification of, learning challenges, but then also the opportunity for intervention and what that does.
Absolutely. If we're able to get children connected with services at the earliest stage possible, whether that's in their toddler years or even in their early elementary years. Again, the brain is the most plastic, so it's most susceptible to being able to build these new connections. But I think beyond the actual development of these connections, it also speaks to what empowering the children with tools can do. It helps avoid the cascade of when you're an itty bitty kiddo and you don't recognize maybe that something is a little bit more challenging. Maybe you really don't like, numbers or letters. And every time maybe we bring up, some academic content at school or maybe wanting to go play. But I think what happens is when kiddos get a little bit older too, there's the recognition of, wait, this is maybe something that's more challenging for me. Now I'm internalizing that, my peers are being successful and I'm having a really hard time. And so I think beyond the concept of neuroplasticity is getting kiddos help earlier can help avoid the internalization of failure and avoid the cascade effect too of anxiety, school, refusal or being reticent to attend school. And so I think not only can we help build those foundational skills via early intervention, but also have more long-term gains in terms of mental health and wellness and overall perception of their self and their self-confidence and their perception of their abilities to succeed in an academic environment.
Yes. And you have the opportunity to normalize, working hard at something that is challenging and that you can show improvement over time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's connected to the amount of work that you're putting in. Right. And we teach kids this with respect to sports and respect to arts and things like that. The more you draw, the better that you get at it, all these talents and skills. But oftentimes we don't make those connections in the same way when it relates to academic related tasks or different cognitive tasks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a big question that I'm sure you get asked too is like, how do you nurture neuroplasticity? How do we go about this? How do we build those neural connections and rewire some of those pathways? And I think, it speaks to, developmental enrichment or enriched environments and building those relationships and not thinking so much of the quantity of maybe some interventions or, buying the children all of the toys, but it's how you use the quality of engaging in these activities and building the relationship and co-regulating while you're engaging in some of these activities that may not be as fun for the kiddos or just be more challenging for them. And so, enriching the kiddos early on can be so powerful and supporting them to build that solid foundation. I like to think of, something that I say often to my families is when we think of early intervention and we think about your kiddo, growing up, we're building a house. And to build that house, you need to have that solid foundation. If that foundation is, maybe a little bit rocky, if a storm comes in or an earthquake comes in, our house is just not as stable. And so I like to think of early intervention and throwing a lot of support early on as building a solid foundation so your kiddo has to build more skills on in the future.
Yes. And the exciting thing about the brain and what we mean by neuroplasticity is that we have the opportunity to literally shape the architecture of our brain, right? Which
Absolutely.
changes all the things that we do, our behavior, the way we learn, the way we process information, the way we engage with information around us.
Absolutely. Because I think of when we talk about the science of neuroplasticity, right? It is this overarching, I mentioned, superpower of the brain to grow and learn. And how does it do that, right? We know that there's, the aspect of structural neuroplasticity, the actual growth of new neural connections, and, more functional neuroplasticity, where we're rerouting some connections. And I think this becomes so relevant for our diverse learners because when we, talk about kiddos with learning differences, and I really believe in calling these learning differences versus learning disabilities, because it really is a difference in how the brain is processing information. And it's not that your child's brain cannot learn to read, cannot learn to write, or is broken in any means. It's just that it's processing that information differently. And so I think neuroplasticity, both aspects, structural and functional, really lend itself well to the reframe of a learning difference over a learning disability.
Right, right. And even with the differences in the way a child, a teen, even an adult processes information, there are opportunities to make the processing of that information more efficient, right?
Absolutely.
Through the rewiring of those pathways and strengthening
Absolutely.
of pathways.
I think, and I wonder if you found this, in your work, in our work together as, in pediatrics, that I tell this, I'm a soapbox to my family sometimes when they talk to me about this. I often say, my goal again is to give you information and insight on how your child learns, because that's so relevant to the types of supports they're going to need at school, because education historically, I think, approaches learning from very one size fits all model, but we are not one size fits all learners. We all process information differently. We all experience the same event differently. We have different outlooks on the same exact thing that occurred. Even siblings, they grow up in the same household, but they may have very different experiences in that household. And I think, again, this speaks to this beautiful concept of, our brain processing information differently and our ability to rewire.
Right. And I think that's a really important point. And I think another thing that, we probably both often convey to parents is that even when we're talking about neuroplasticity, we're talking about changing the brain and rewiring the brain. That does not mean we want to change your child, right? We want to make sure that your child can be the best that they can be, learn the best in the traditional environments that they are forced into, right? They have to be in the classroom. They have to learn in this way because that is the way the system is designed. So how can we create an environment that works better for them and help them to navigate that learning environment with the differences that they have?
Absolutely. And I think it starts with, reframing the narrative. There is so much stigma behind, first and foremost, getting an assessment and getting diagnosed. I think so many people view assessment as, oh, you're going to diagnose my child, but it's so much more. It's that roadmap, like you've said before. It's that insight on how you learn. And I think that's the first step, is reframing the narrative and empowering parents, because you're dealing with their precious child. And it can be overwhelming, seeing your child struggle. It can be so heartbreaking, wishing you could help them. And, seeing them then go into school and then the teachers start, giving you clues. Hey, I think, we may have some trouble at school, or, little Johnny is really struggling. And it's such a process for parents to I think of it as, they have to kind of grieve the process of they were wishing that it would be easy for them, but they're seeing the struggles, and then they start seeing maybe anxiety to go to school, related to school, to tests, and they see it impacting the mental health. And so I think helping parents reframe the narrative and destigmatize what we do, I think is such an important part. And then taking it to the educators again, and working collaboratively, I think, and I wonder if you have experienced this in your work. I think there was a time in my training where I think neuropsychologists and schools had somewhat of an adversarial, maybe, right, relationship. And it's like the schools are saying one thing, then the neuropsych is the big bad wolf that comes in and says, no, you need to do this. And I really want to reframe. I wish as a field we could reframe the narrative again, and that we're here to collaborate and let you know how your student learns, because they are capable, they are intelligent, but they learn in this fashion, which then brings us to the interventions. And the interventions aren't a crutch, or they're not by any means an excuse, or they're truly intended to support that child's unique learning style. And so I think that collaboration is so important to our work as well.
It is. And I think part of that, that dissonance early on between parents and educators, and even parents and educators and clinicians, is that parents are often told to wait and see. You probably had the same thing where parents, get to me and their kids are in 5th and 6th grade, but they've kind of seen struggles all along, but they were told, well, let's just wait and see. And, in the short term, that approach can feel reassuring because it's okay. They're not really worried. It's likely that they'll just catch up, on their own through osmosis. It can miss a critical window because we know, and like you're saying, while plasticity in the brain has this ability to change, throughout the lifetime, that early identification and intervention, particularly before age 5, leads to significantly better outcomes in language and cognition and those early building blocks like you were talking about. If we catch them early, it's not that it's too late when you bring them in 6th grade, but if we can catch them earlier and avoid the wait and see, then we have the opportunity to have a bigger impact.
Absolutely. And I think there's even some really amazing studies out there that have looked at specifically targeting early intervention for diverse learners. And I think they found some of the findings is that kiddos who received academic intervention by 1st grade were far more likely to catch up to their, same age peers academically. And I think that's so profound because a 1st grader is quite young. You're thinking of a 7, 8-year-old child. And I think we have this incredible information at our hands. We know early intervention works. I think it's the big hurdle is then getting education systems to recognize also the importance of early intervention and capitalizing on this window of neuroplasticity, because the wait and see model extends beyond, just general pediatrics. But I think it truly also is very much embraced in the education system as well. You see the vast majority, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, in your time, assessing that the vast majority of kiddos start getting referred for IEPs in 3rd and 4th, 5th grade, like you said. And we've passed, all of this window. But if we approached it from an early intervention framework, we may, in theory, have avoided some of these more longer term supports and interventions that child would need. And we also may have been able to avoid the mental health toll on those kiddos.
Yes. And that mental health piece is so important because when they get to 5th and 6th grade and they've been struggling since kindergarten, you see the significant impact on their self-concept. You see more anxiety, you see more sadness, you see more comparison to peers, and you also find that there's this loss of interest in learning, right? And this is something that they're going to continue to do, if they graduate, to 12th grade or even beyond 12th grade. It's something that's a system there that they have to continue to navigate. And so when you lose that sense of self and your ability to be successful in this environment that you have to navigate through, and then you don't feel like any of the work that you're doing is beneficial and working, then you lose that willingness to learn in this environment that you're in.
Absolutely. And I think, along those lines as well, it speaks to the foundation of the house. We know that academics in general builds upon itself. You first learn to identify your letters and numbers, then you learn to decode, then you start to blend. And then with mathematics, you're starting to learn the sequence of the numbers and then how to add them and then subtract them. And so all of these fundamental foundational skills that happen during this early intervention window in these preschool, TK, kinder years are so instrumental to that higher level learning that a kiddo is going to have to engage in when they're in the middle school, high school years. And if you have that rocky foundation, it just makes it so much more effortful and challenging for these kiddos. But had we focused on really strengthening those skills early on and not saying, they'll catch up, or wait and see, who knows what we could have really been able to help support them, and foster those skills.
Yes. And identifying those areas that are lagging, whether it's language processing or auditory processing or, social emotional development. We have the opportunity through evaluations to identify that those are areas that are lagging. And then we can match the intervention to stimulate those areas of the brain. And that's really neuroplasticity in action. It's the right kind of input and support, strengthening those neural circuits, which leads to that cognitive change and behavioral change.
Absolutely. And I think identifying, early learning differences can be challenging. But I think it's certainly, possible for early educators to work collaboratively with us and letting them know, I think we're seeing some differences in the phonemic processing or decoding or blending. Let's get them connected with an early interventionist to support some of these, foundational reading skills. Because like you said, it's not just any intervention. It's targeted interventions that are appropriate for their learning style, right? Something that we talk about often in our field of neuropsychology is, what type of learner are you? Are you more visual? Are you, more auditory? Are you someone who, reads a book and you have the photographic memory and you will never forget it? And so connecting with our teens and our kiddos to be able to speak to their learning differences. And I think what I love too is when they found that I've captured their learning style in the testing, or I'm like, hey, I wonder, would you say you're more of a visual learner? Does something, when this happens at school, is it really frustrating? Like, yes. And it's almost like this weight lifts off their shoulder because we've been able to capture it and we're able to tell them learning and study strategies that can help them, and reframe the narrative again, saying that these study tips and tricks aren't because your brain is broken. Aren't because you're not smart by any means. This is just how your brain processes information.
Yes. And so, you work with really young kiddos and maybe you can speak to some red flags or things that parents can be looking for. And even in those early stages, I mean, you work with toddlers,
I do.
And there are things that you can see that can signal, this is a red flag. This is a risk factor. Your child is at increased risk for having difficulties with language processing or reading down the road. What are some things that you see or some red flags that can alert parents that they might need to do like an early assessment or a screen or something so that they can get in early with those interventions?
Yes, the early intervention crowd is my passion population. I love working with the itty bitties, as we call them. And it is such a joy to instill hope in the families that this is what we're seeing developmentally. And these are some of the things that we can help, do to nurture and foster and, facilitate development. And so when I'm working with a family in the early, years, my kiddos who are under 3 and under 5, some of these early learning, red flags can be differences in their speech acquisition or some speech delays. When they're first starting to engage with the alphabet, are they able to readily identify the alphabet, but more so connecting them with their corresponding sound or phonemic awareness? Are they understanding that B has B sound? And then beyond that, can they then start to blend certain sounds and decode some of those sounds together? And so I think those are some of the difference that we see, or early potential warning signs for, potential reading differences. And I know what I just mentioned is such an enormous, broad category. But what I also know, and I often tell my families that I work with, is that behavior is communication. And so if you notice your child is really emotionally not connecting with, pre-academic material, and they're really starting to show some frustration, they're, engaging in a way that's not typical that they would. They're typically very easygoing. And then you ask them to maybe, start engaging with some early math or early reading academics, and they're really disengaged. They're really not interested. That can also be a sign that they are having a harder time understanding and processing that information, because in the early toddler period, kids love, positive reinforcement. They want to demonstrate their skills. If they know something, they want to tell you and they want to show it to you. And so if you see, kiddos having a hard time engaging or being really resistant to this pre-academic material, that may be a warning sign that they are maybe processing something differently.
Yes. And for parents who are noticing those things, what would you say is their next step in terms of accessing support? Because sometimes they don't know where to go. They might be the teacher they go to first, or maybe it's their pediatrician. Like, what are you seeing?
Absolutely. And that is, it depends largely on age. So educational therapists and executive functioning coaches are such an incredible resource to our kiddos, because they are trained in evidence-based strategies to support learning differences. They, take our results and they take the information on how the child learns, and they are utilizing these interventions to teach the academic content and how their brain absorbs. And so there's many that are well known: Orrin Gillingham, Seeing Stars, Sounds and Syllables. These are some of those more formal interventions that you'll see later down the road in, the elementary years. But there are some providers that are now working with younger and younger demographics of kiddos, because these early pre-learning skills are so important. And while an ed therapist may not be appropriate for a toddler or a preschooler, folks like speech pathologists can be really instrumental in helping kiddos, understanding and decoding and blending some of those phonemic sounds. Occupational therapists can also be incredibly helpful and support some fine motor difficulties or weaknesses. If kiddos are having a really hard time grasping their pencil, hard time manipulating small, materials, that can then impact how they go and write at school. So speech pathologists, occupational therapists can be really helpful in those earlier years, and then pass the baton on to educational therapists or executive functioning coaches as the kiddos grow and develop, but then meeting them still where they're at developmentally.
Yes. And again, I mean, you're describing, again, matching the area of weakness or the area where a child needs more support with the intervention, from, language delays in the ability to express yourself or to understand language, to a speech and language therapy, to kiddos who are struggling with communication and getting that support that targets communication, social skills. And you mentioned OT for kiddos that are struggling in, or showing those weaknesses in motor development, being able to strengthen their motor coordination and their fine motor skills. I mean, that's exactly what the interventions are doing. So we're not just compensating by saying we're going to find a workaround. We're actually creating those new pathways and strengthening existing pathways. And that, again, like you were saying, reduces stress and it increases the opportunities to learn.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Early intervention is so incredibly important. And again, engaging in early intervention doesn't mean that there's something wrong. You think of it just as that extra boost of learning in that enriched environment to help foster development, so that in the future, maybe some of these things that may have been challenging for them had we not intervened, maybe now it's a strength. And now it's not a stretch no more anymore. It's a strength of theirs.
Right. And I've seen that. I've seen that with kiddos who I've tested and done these assessments on, connected them with a specific intervention or, a combination of interventions, see them, a year later, 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, and all these areas where they're really struggling, they're either at par with their peers or sometimes they're actually performing above their peers, slightly above their peers in certain areas. And again, it speaks to the idea that the potential was always there. But again, connecting the intervention to their particular learning and cognitive profile was really key.
Absolutely. And I think, there's some really wonderful studies out there too that have taken the examination of how interventions help these diverse learners even further and looking at brain scans, looking at activation of certain areas that are consistent with certain learning profiles. And these studies continually find that early intervention dramatically improves activation in these certain areas that govern reading, that govern number sense and visual spatial processing. And so it really speaks to that you're building a skill set, at the most fundamental level and creating those new pathways and strengthening some of those pathways that just needed a little extra support or rewiring how the brain is processing information.
Right. And what that feels like to a child who is experiencing these brain changes is that they don't feel like they have to work as hard, right? It's not as frustrating to them. Things are a little easier for them. Their learning is a little more efficient. And that is such a powerful thing to experience for a child to experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it also speaks to an early intervention. If a child hasn't recognized yet that something is challenging for them, they'll never feel that disappointment. They'll never feel that sense of, again, failure, that internalized failure that, oh, I'm not the smart one, but my friends, they always get, they always know the answer. And I don't raise my hand in class. And so to have that at the earliest point to change that trajectory, that mental health trajectory. And I often tell families, it's not just important to address the skill set that we're trying to support work the stretch, but we also want to help the mental wellness piece and address the mental wellness piece because that manifests in different ways at different developmental, periods. When they're younger, we may be seeing more hyperactivity, right? Running away from desks, maybe eloping, really big emotions. But then that evolves. That behavior evolves to, be internalized in their self-concept, the anxiety that they may experience walking into school, going into a Friday that happens to be the spelling quiz or a big test. And so the early intervention is just so incredibly powerful.
Yes. And that link between learning and mental health is really key because as you probably experience, parents might bring their kiddos in saying, reading is the real struggle or attention, they just can't sit still and the teacher's always calling. But we know that when we intervene, we don't just improve their ability to focus or improve their ability to read fluently. It really has a powerful ripple effect on their mental health, which is what we've really been saying this whole time.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. It extends to their relationship with their caregivers. It extends to their peers. It extends to how they relate to their teachers. And that is so, so relevant because I think, we spoke about it earlier and you highlighted it so well that once they get into those early preteen years, you've lost motivation. And now all of those big dreams that they may have had when they were itty bitty, I want to be a doctor, a veterinarian, a firefighter, a policeman, may have been dramatically changed because of some of those, difficulties that they may have had when they were younger.
Yes. They may start to believe that I can't do that.
Exactly.
Right? Or I could never do this. Right.
Yes.
And when they were younger, they didn't have those limitations. They didn't put those limitations on themselves.
Absolutely. And I think neuroplasticity, again, it's just one of my favorite concepts. It's, I can definitely geek out forever on neuroplasticity, but
we could keep talking about this over and over again. But I think it's really important because, again, it's not just about, addressing the issue that is impacting your child now. It's really looking down the road. When I think about, the idea, and I think you may have mentioned this, emotional regulation. It's really hard to learn in a classroom when you are dysregulated. It is really hard to cooperate at home in a home environment when you are dysregulated. It's hard to make friends when you are dysregulated. And imagine being able to address that struggle and that difficulty early on. It impacts so many different aspects of a child's life.
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about dysregulation and, when we talk about looking at developmental and processing differences in the early childhood years, so many different, I don't want to say symptoms, but behaviors can mimic other, diagnoses, right? If a child is very dysregulated in, class, a teacher may say, oh, they're ADHD, but in fact, maybe they're dysregulated because what they're engaging with academically is just very challenging and they're processing the information and we're not presenting the information the way they learn. So what ultimately ends up happening is we start seeing, like we mentioned, the behavioral dysregulation. Maybe we're getting super fidgety in class. And so parents then go to their pediatrician saying, my teacher's saying my kiddos may be ADHD. And now we're intervening in a completely different landscape than we should be. We're addressing attention and activity level, whereas we should really be looking at how are they learning and processing information, which I think brings us back to the benefit and power of having a comprehensive evaluation. What is happening and why? And most importantly, what can we do to support that diverse learner?
Yes. And that is the reason we do assessments. And I tell parents all the time, this is not about getting a diagnosis, like you said early on. It's about understanding why your child is struggling, right? Why your child is responding in this manner. What is the behavior telling you? And that is our job, is to figure out what that is.
Absolutely. It's why I think we have one of the best jobs.
I do. I think so too.
Yeah.
So if you could leave parents with one hopeful or a couple hopeful takeaways about the assessment process and early intervention, what would it be? We were talking about hope because I really think this is a hopeful process.
I completely agree. And I think of, one hopeful tidbit or one, reminder is that your child hasn't done something yet. The power of yet. They haven't learned it yet. And that's really where our evaluation comes to play, is how can you teach them and how can you support them to access those yets? The power of yet is so beautiful. And I think it really speaks to neuroplasticity. And, remembering that our evaluations are not intended to pathologize or label, but they're really at the core intended for you to understand and have a greater insight on how your little one learns.
Yes. This has been such a great conversation. I could talk about this, like I said before, for another hour. If parents want to reach out to you because they want to hear more and learn more about neurodevelopmental or neuropsychological assessments, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
That's a great question. If folks want to connect with me, they can visit my website at www.thecnpc.com, and they can actually find our contact information, see our team, and also schedule a complimentary consultation with me directly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been so much fun.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Our conversation reminds us that assessments and interventions really aren't just tools to manage challenges. They're opportunities to shape the brain itself. And when we act early, we're not just reacting to problems, we're proactively building stronger foundations for learning, connection, and resilience. If you're concerned about your child's development or simply want to better understand how to support them, the earlier you seek guidance, the more possibilities you create. Thanks again for listening. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future conversations. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.